The legal principle of qualified immunity can shield law enforcement officers from liability. It often comes up in the context of a questionable shooting by police. But in New Jersey, U.S. Marshals arrested and detained a woman with the same name as the person they wanted. She was jailed for nearly 2 weeks, but now a judge has ruled she cannot sue the Marshals because they have qualified immunity. So, Ben, who should be held accountable for law enforcement mistakes?
Well, for law enforcement mistakes, I would say the agency that's hiring people and screening people that need to be trustworthy and competent. In addition to that, they need to be properly trained with the relevant knowledge and have some experience related to things, and also have the education necessary to deal with a wide range of things. In this kind of case, you have multiple jurisdictions involved because the marshals arrested her and would have taken her to a local jail where she would have been processed. At that point, the fingerprints should have been taken. Sometimes that could be down, or the person that was actually had the warrant out for arrest may not have been in the system.
And in this case, the woman wants to sue the Marshals, but the Marshals may have made the arrest, but weren't necessarily the ones who kept her in jail for some period of time.
Yeah, in this case, she wanted to, and in fact did, name, I think it was 6 marshals in the lawsuit, along with 30 other people. So this ruling out of the Third Circuit had specifically to do with whether the arresting marshals were to be blamed. And in this case, I'd have to say no, because they were acting on the basis of a constitutionally valid warrant. They were also provided as an attachment to that warrant a copy of her driver's license with her address. And then thirdly, as Ben pointed out, they were not responsible for the detention. In fact, the same day that she was arrested, she was processed, she was booked, and they only assisted with that booking. This was not a case of a mistaken identity. To my mind, this was a case of a failure to identify, because before they transferred her from New Jersey to Pennsylvania, it was somebody's job to ensure that, in fact, she was the right person, because the case, her having absconded, or whoever the person was, that's back in 1993. So surely you want to know, do we have the right person?
So in this case, qualified immunity applies, and they should, it's not the Marshals did not make the mistake, is what you're saying.
Yeah, the qualified immunity applies to the Marshals, but the other 30 individuals, we don't know. Those who processed her, who booked her, and who transferred her.
And that gets back to Ben's point about training. Luke?
Law enforcement is a very difficult job, but their primary purpose is to keep people safe. And in this situation, throughout the entire chain of command, it seems like an individual was put in danger and I think should have recourse legally. Nina does a good job parsing the technicalities here. I'm not completely convinced the Marshals shouldn't be held liable at all, but I do agree the people who detained this woman for an extended period of time certainly should. And I have to point out, if someone like Ben and I were in this situation and mistakenly detained rather than a black woman from Jamaica, I think it's much more likely within 24 hours, if not shorter, this would have been sorted out. So that's just another level of concern to add to this conversation.
And Tara, should there be limits on this idea of qualified immunity?
Absolutely. Qualified immunity has been used to allow, moving beyond this case, qualified immunity has been used to allow police to get away with police brutality, failure to check all of their facts in terms of going to the wrong address, shooting someone who was coming home, had his keys in the door, and with his Subway sandwich in his hand. So qualified immunity has been used to allow police to make some really egregious, and I'm going to use the term in quotes, mistakes. Sometimes there's a question about whether it really was a mistake, but mistakes. And part of the concern, I think, for the average citizen, and certainly for people of color, is that qualified immunity takes away responsibility. All the rest of us have to take responsibility for our actions. Why shouldn't law enforcement and broader government, because qualified immunity does apply to not just law enforcement, broader government officials, why shouldn't they have to take responsibility for their actions as well?
Several states have passed laws prohibiting or limiting qualified immunity. Should New York do
No,
something?
no, it is absolutely necessary to continue to have officers in our environment where they have to make decisions, split-second decisions, usually reactive decisions, in a high-risk, low-frequency event with no time to think it through. So they absolutely need the protection. But it is up to the agency to make sure that they have training that is relevant and that they can make those decisions properly. If you're putting the officer at risk in addition to their lives and their families, that is unacceptable.
But that's the job that they sign up for, and all of us
Well,
are responsible.
They were,
Hang
but
on a
not
second.
to the same
We're
rate
all
they are now.
responsible
We've had
for
over
whatever we do on our
250
job.
officers
If
shot
in
this year.
fact there is an instance in which you have both the question of qualified immunity for the individual as opposed to qualified immunity for the person who is acting on the job, absolutely, the actions that are taken under color of law, provided that they are within the parameters that have been set by the hiring agency, if those fall short, absolutely that officer should be held responsible, as would any other employer. Now, to your point of whether they should be sued personally, that's something to consider, not just because somehow they don't know what's going on. Some of these cases are really egregious that we're talking about, but there's also the issue of us having fewer and fewer folks who want to go into law enforcement. So perhaps the fix is let's start requiring educational requirements for law enforcement officers, which we don't.
Qualified immunity doesn't cover egregious actions. That is not covered. It's covered.
This is egregious.
This,
In my opinion.
The total circumstance is egregious with multiple jurisdictions that drop the ball on who this person really was. Unfortunately, if we took people's word that they are not actually the person that committed the crime and they're innocent, we would not have anybody in prison.
The only thing that was necessary here to correct this was something that happens every time someone is taken into custody, and that is they are fingerprinted. It took them over 2 weeks simply to fingerprint this woman and to find that her fingerprints didn't match. But I go back to my original point, which is if you're talking about someone who was who absconded in 1993, and here we are in 2019, and you think you have all of the correct information, it takes a kindergartner to know we need to check and know our facts.